Well, Oregon's got a new offensive line coach, and he's got a lot of players coming in the 2023 class. Which of those true freshmen could be the most impactful this year? They're probably on defense. Here we go.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. If you haven't already, please like, comment, subscribe wherever you listen to or watch this show. If you want to drop a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, appreciate that as well. Also appreciate FanDuel for bringing you today's episode, the official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Yes, I am recording this live from the Venetian Hotel room. I won't share the number. That feels a little bit... Yes, indeed. For those of you listening on podcast, it's a bird, it's a plane. No, it is John Garcia Jr., our director of recruiting here at the Locked On Network, though comparing him to Superman is indeed, I think, a worthy comparison, just in my particular view, John. But it's great to have you back on the show as always. And we've got a new offensive line coach. A'lique Terry was at Oregon very briefly. He's bounced around a little bit. Your reactions to Oregon making that hire after Adrian Klemm left to go to the NFL?
Another kind of Dan Lanning, high upside, young, energetic. I've been there and done that type of hire, and that is exactly how he's built this thing at Oregon thus far. A'lique Terry, first of all, great ACC offensive lineman. Not that long ago at Wake Forest, 4-year starter. Coming out of Miami, Florida, it was a sleeper recruit. He was a guy that I actually covered for a little bit, so feeling a little old today. And was a great kid to talk to. Very much always had the big picture in mind, even as a 16, 17-year-old. So I wasn't surprised to see him play well, hit the ground running in college, and then he got right into coaching. He coached there at Wake. As you mentioned, he was at Oregon in 2019. Hawaii, and then was with the Vikings last year as an assistant D-line coach, which is interesting because, long-time, career O-lineman who coached on the offensive side of the ball, and then you get that NFL experience, but it's on the defensive line. So naturally, you get the push-pull. It's like recruiting a two-way prospect, right? They have a little bit better understanding of the position. So I think those credentials and his playing experience, in addition to the youth, will allow him to really hit the ground running. He's already recruited. He's already coached at a power for an FBS level as the O-line coach for Hawaii in a pretty wide open offense. So, some of those traits will carry over, and he had been at Oregon before. So he knows specifically the expectation, the culture there. I think 19 was a Rose Bowl season there for the Ducks. So he won while he was there. And certainly that appeal was going to be intriguing to him. Look, there's not a lot of guys who jump up to the league, even if for 1 year, and then jump back to college. I think that tells you where A'lique's passion is. So I think the playing experience, the NFL cup of coffee or whatever we want to call it, will pair nicely with his youth. And honestly ties back to a state that Oregon's seemingly always going to recruit, back in his hometown state of Florida. So I think it profiles really well. I saw it on Twitter and, kind of smiled a little bit. I think this is a really nice move for the Ducks, because if he becomes a great O-line coach, you've got him on the ground floor, which means he'll become that coach, in Eugene as opposed to somewhere else.
And he's another young guy for the Ducks and Dan Lanning. And that's something that has been a recurring theme. Like Klemm, I think, was actually one of the older coaches on the staff this past year. I think Tosh Lupoi is even one of the older coaches. He's still pretty sure in his 40s. I think he's like early to mid 40s somewhere around there. So it's been sort of a consistent theme. And I think, the upside exists in the recruiting space for someone who's younger. I think the relatability to players is a very real thing for these, these generations of recruits that we're seeing year in and year out. And that certainly presents a lot of upside on the recruiting front. I think the drawback, if you want to look at it that way, is the experience is not going to be there quite as much. You have coaches who it feels like they're kind of learning on the job, but I feel like the upside here is very real because he is coming into a very talented room, not just with high school players the Ducks have had, but the transfers that Adrian Klemm was able to bring in along with Dan Lanning before Klemm left to go to the NFL. So I think at the very least, John, he's coming into a good situation.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there's no doubt about that part of it, which is probably, again, you don't make that jump often, even as an assistant position coach in the NFL. But if you're going to do it, you want to go where there's a lot of great talent. And certainly Oregon has that. And he understands, again, what the expectation and culture is like specifically in Eugene. I should also mention he was a center, so smart guy who got his entire offensive line lined up, called out protections, things like that. So I think those guys get a little bit more benefit of the doubt amongst offensive linemen. So I really like this get. Again, this young theme, as you mentioned, Spencer, it's more important than it ever has been in recruiting to be able to relate to players, to prospects, because it has changed so much in the last 10 years, even from when Alik was coming out of high school. But you've got to still communicate with those guys, which means it's through multiple avenues, right? It's on the phone, it's FaceTime, it's texting, it's DMs, it's sharing videos, cracking a joke. There's so many different elements to it. And then on top of it, with NIL, now it's branding. So that NFL feather in the cap means even more because not only, of course, did you coach at the very highest level of the sport on this planet, but you've also dealt with personalities, guys who have their own brands, like a Justin Jefferson, a Dalvin Cook. I mean, that Vikings D line, has some characters within it as well. Daniil Hunter comes to mind. So, I think that experience will help in and of itself on top of it because it's a modern recruiting hire, and that's what you got to do. If you look around the country, there are splashes like this with, plenty of coaches well short of age 30 that are hitting the ground running both on the field and specifically from a recruiting perspective. So not a huge surprise to see Dan continue to push in that direction.
I was curious. He only spent 1 year in the NFL, so he doesn't have, a huge track record at this point in time yet. But I was wondering whether or not Lanning would go back to the well on a coach who had been in the NFL before, because that indicates, as we learned with Adrian Klemm, that his long-term interests might rest there. Whereas if you're an offensive line coach at Oregon and you've only ever been at the college ranks, Oregon is among the most attractive places, at least in my view, to be. And there are not too many other opportunities, barring, of course, a coordinator position opening up, if that's something that intrigues him, that would draw him away. But it does, and I'm sure Oregon fans are already talking about this sort of stuff, know them as I do at this point in time, about, well, if he was in the NFL, does he have that sort of interest? Does he have that sort of draw? Could that be someone who does that? And I want to ask John that particular question, but I also want to ask you why you haven't checked out FanDuel yet. I'm in Las Vegas right now. I'd still consider checking out the FanDuel Sportsbook app because it is the #1 sportsbook in these United States. New customers can get a no sweat bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. It is not as easy to bet sports as you may think. I know from personal experience. Then you can bet on everything at FanDuel, from the money line, point scores, threes drain, whatever you want. You can just suddenly make anything interesting. An NBA game between the Pistons and the Magic could suddenly become electrifying if you go check out FanDuel. They are a bunch of NBA bets every single week. Spread, money line, total, anything and everything you want. So don't miss the chance to get your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook betting partner of the NBA. So getting back into things here with John Garcia, our recruiting insider here at the Locked On Network. And also, just to be clear, no, I am not actually paying for this room at the Venetian. My buddy's here for a work conference. He had space in his room, and here I am. Not just so we're all operating on the same wavelength here.
They're like, hey, the Locked On Network pays well, huh?
They do pay
Vegas for
that.
Super Bowl week, post Super Bowl week. I see.
Not bad. Life, yeah, I wasn't complaining. Life is not too bad. But Oregon fans, John, will no doubt be wondering, is this a move? And then we are going to get to some recruiting specifics here. Is this a move that we could see Alik Terry make one day where he wants to go back to the NFL? Do you think that's a reasonable concern, or did going to the league feel more like a bit of a pit stop for him?
There's a lot of college feel with the league, and again, you don't leave it to go back to it if you hate it, right? The big drawback for coaches right now in college versus the NFL is that ever changing profile of how to recruit players and how much harder and more time consuming it is. That's usually the reason why you jump in and you stay in the league, right? It's a little bit more narrow. Certainly, it's more volatile, but you don't have to recruit. Maybe a free agent here and there. So typically, when you do jump back, it means you love it. And Alik is a guy who, again, he's been at so many places in different roles at the collegiate level that you kind of have to. I mean, this young man, excuse me, has literally been all over the country doing this, from Miami to Wake Forest, Hawaii, up to Minnesota now, back to Eugene for a second stint. He's scaled the country as an O-line guru. So I think he loves it. I got a DM into him right now. Hopefully he gets back to me and I can let you know for sure. But he's definitely excited about getting back to the collegiate game. And he's able to have that post by himself now, right? He's the offensive line coach. I think that's the biggest difference. He had that at Hawaii, no disrespect to that program, but it's a major step up to a couple of years later being able to do that at Oregon in a Pac-12 that, look, I can't remember this much excitement for the conference, right? So to jump back in at this point, I do think says a lot. The brand, all that stuff is still incredibly strong with Oregon. And I think it shows in not only recruiting players, but recruiting coaches, as we've seen Lanning not only fill these open roles pretty quickly, but he's doing so with some interesting names that are going to probably work out for the better.
Let's switch over to the recruiting side, which is, of course, your primary area of expertise. But as everyone has learned on today's show, John is a man of many talents and a vast wealth of knowledge to be sure. So let's examine Oregon's 2023 recruiting class here and who the most impactful players could be, specifically on the defensive side of the ball. I think offense we might have to save for a conversation for another day, next week perhaps. But the defense is where Oregon has the most questions going into this season. They've added a lot of portal players who figure to be starters, the Evan Williams and the Tysheem Johnsons of the world, maybe Kyrie Jackson. But I want to focus on the high school recruiting ranks. And just so everyone keeps this in perspective, recruiting classes from the high school ranks do still matter. In the portal era, though, it's a lot easier for those kids to maybe have to wait another year to see more playing time. Because from the 2022 recruiting class, which were also filled with players that Dan Lanning and this staff did not specifically recruit, so they may be more inclined to play guys who they have recruited this year. The only true freshman who saw meaningful snaps a year ago, there were 4, and really there were 3. Josh Connerly in the jumbo package, Jordan James also primarily in that jumbo package, Jalil Florence was probably the most impactful true freshman, and Kamari Terrell played a little bit on the defensive side as well. So as we kind of pilfer through and attempt to find the defensive players who might see the field as really young players for the Ducks in 2023, John, let's keep it on the defensive side of the ball today, because I think that's where the most impactful players could probably come from anyway, except for maybe Jurion Dickey. Who stands out to you as a true freshman that could be on the field for the Ducks this year when the games are still in the balance?
Well, look, we know there's going to be a lot of turnover across the board, but the secondary in particular is where not only do you see that at Oregon at the highest level. I mean, look, Christian Gonzalez, it's like he's mocked higher and higher every time I look.
Yep.
But you saw an emphasis at the end of the recruiting cycle in the secondary in particular. And typically the guys who hit the ground running as DBs, making that transition from high school to college, they bring more than one thing to the table. So either you're incredibly long, but you've also got this, or you're this short, fast guy, but you also bring this to the table. And I look at Dalen Austin and Rod Pleasant, and I look at them as potential fill-in guys, glue guys who can help in the margins, even if all these transfers come over and take these starting spots. One, because you can never have too many defensive backs, right? And you're talking about 5 or 6 in a very conventional game plan, especially again in a very quarterback-friendly Pac-12 that we're going to see roll out in 23. So with Austin, Long Beach Poly guy, extremely long, extremely twitchy player, but he's got great instincts and ball skills. So he might not be a guy you say, hey, go out and cover, Stanford's best one-on-one, but come play this underneath zone because you've got the range and you've got the instincts to come out and make some plays. And he's also got collegiate size. He's already 185 pounds, probably be closer to 200 by the time he actually suits up for the Ducks. And he's got great linear speed. So that always points you to special teams or cracking the rotation in another way. And then Roderick Pleasant, speed is really the name of his game, arguably the fastest football player that ran track in this class of 2023. So we know from the beginning, a Jay Sarah guy, great receiver, great returner in high school as well. You think he's probably going to factor into that really early in his Oregon career. But even defensively, again, he's a guy who's got such elite speed that even if the technique isn't quite there, he can make up for so much of it. So you think of your nickel, your dime packages. What are you combating? Running backs out of the backfield that are becoming better pass catchers than ever, and slot receivers that have a two-way go that are harder to defend than ever. So typically it's the ultra polished or just the ultra twitchy guys that you want to combat them with. And I think Rod Pleasant has a lot of that in his bag headed to Oregon. So 2 late gets. Austin was committed to LSU. Pleasant was a true heavyweight battle with USC. I think both of those could pay off pretty much immediately for Dan Lanning, which is, kind of par for the course, right? You saw that great late splash in the cycle. You wonder if that group of players is going to pay off, and I think it will.
And I don't think there's a possibility, given the players in this class, that we don't see any true freshmen play at least some meaningful snaps over the course of the year. I mean, Lanning showed and his staff a propensity to do that with players who they either snagged late, like Josh Connerly was a guy that they pushed for really hard. There was that great video of Lanning getting all fired up for landing him, and guess what? He ended up playing a lot as a true freshman. Jaleel Florence, same sort of deal. He was kind of wishy-washy on Oregon after Cristobal left. But then Lanning came in, he chose the Ducks, he ended up playing a pretty good amount. A lot of those other players were, Mario Cristobal recruits, still good players for sure. But I think when you have that personal connection, it increases the likelihood that they could potentially see the field. I'm most intrigued by Rod Pleasant in that speed, not just because it felt like Oregon secondary was lacking that speed at times in 2022, but also in the return game, because that's one of the things that stands out to him or about him on his high school recruiting film is his ability to contribute in the return game. There is no way, there is absolutely no way, though Hudson had some decent moments in the return game, there is no set, surefire, number one returner for the Ducks going into this year. And if that's the case, John, is Pleasant the sort of player that could be that guy or one of those guys as a true freshman?
Absolutely. I'd be pretty surprised if he was not at least, in the running pretty quickly. Kick return and punt return, by the way. This is we always lump them together. They're very different, but I think Pleasant can excel in both fields. Again, I think day one when he arrives, if he hasn't enrolled already, you do sprints, you do the run test, whatever it is early on. And this is the guy who's going to be winning all of those races, right? At full go. The day he gets to campus. And that's not just, hey, you won a battle for a very fast player. That is head turning. That's something that everybody can realize and understand immediately when you get on the field. So that type of talent is not to be wasted. So I think that combined with his experience on offense and in the return game will allow him to do so. I think with that true speed, you lean a little bit more towards the kick returning element, but there's some quickness and elusiveness there. It's not just a linear speed kind of situation like a Ted Ginn of yesteryear. there's some wiggle here with Rod Pleasant. And he's kind of marketed as this smaller, faster type, and he certainly is, but he's not tiny. He's 5'11", he's 185 or so. He's got enough juice right now physically to hold up, because a lot of these track guys, hey, he's smaller and faster. So you're like, oh, well, one hit and we'll see. Not the case with Pleasant. Got to measure him up late in the cycle in person, and he was bigger than I thought he would be. He's not generously listed. I think he's going to factor in, again, whether it's the DB rotation and or the return game, pretty much day one when he gets to Eugene.
I wonder, because I've also heard some rumblings about him playing some slot receiver, going both ways, doing that. I wonder if he couldn't be a Charles Nelson type player, who I think was Oregon's really last great returner. Mikhail Wright on kick returns was pretty darn good. Another defensive back who had high end speed. He had a couple kick return touchdowns in his career, 2 or 3 if I'm not mistaken. But I think Charles Nelson is the kind of guy that, Austin's a little bit more defensively oriented, but can play both ways, little smaller, high-end speed, quickness, and Nelson was a really, really good kick returner. I think the Ducks have just been missing that for a couple of years. Before we answer a mailbag question here and look way, way ahead to the future, Matayo Uiagalelei is the name defensively that stands out, not just because of the caliber recruit that he is, but the position that he plays, which was such a big weakness for the Ducks a year ago. Is he a guy who you think slides right in and starts right away, is playing a lot, part of the rotation? How do you see him projecting as a true freshman? Because I think that's the other kind of obvious name that you look at in this recruiting cycle and say, that's a true freshman who could play right away.
Yeah, I think when we talk about rotations, it's not with a negative connotation, especially when you talk about the D line. This is the group that needs to rotate, right? Because if you want to get after the passer consistently, these guys are on some type of, 6-3 rotation relative to their backup. So it's really the 2 deep that you're dealing with as an offensive game planner going into any given week. So in that regard, yeah, I think Uiagalelei sees the field right away. He cracks that rotation. And again, he brings versatility. That's the common thread. If you're going to see the field early, you got to do more than one thing, particularly on the defensive side of the ball. And his frame will allow him to work inside or outside. So depending on the opponent and the packages that Lanning and company draw up, I think you could see a bunch of Uiagalelei, particularly early in the season, right? You're going to play, Portland State right out of the gate.
Yep.
So you're gonna build up, right? There's no Georgia week 1 kind of here we go kind of game. So I do think that's a good thing for, figuring out what you have on your own roster. You could do a little bit more evaluating, no disrespect, against Portland State than you could against the defending national champs. So I do think that buildup will help those young guys see the field, and Uiagalelei will be able to make it happen. He's got enough twitch on the edge to live there and stay there as a true freshman, even at 265. But really, the intrigue is, can he be that inside-out pass rusher? Can he be the guy that puts pressure immediately on the interior of the offensive line as opposed to working downhill against offensive tackles? So now that he's focused really for the first time in his life on one position, I think you could see not only, physically him being ready to go, but, mentally and technically he's going to be able to hone in on it and kind of hit the ground running. There's a bit of a chip on his shoulder as well. I don't think he liked the way the cycle ended relative to his recruitment and some of that other stuff. So
yeah, his composite rating just like keeps coming down, which frankly, if it puts a chip on his shoulder, I'm good.
I'm not going to give the quotes that I got from the family, but let's just say they're aware. They're aware of how it went down there in the end. So that'll be fascinating to track.
Yeah, I like that they open with Portland State. Week 2, you got to go to Lubbock, play at Texas Tech. That will not be an easy game. Coach McGuire is the guy that's over there, right? I think he did a really nice job in year 1, putting together an 8-win season, knocking off Ole Miss in a bowl game. I think that's a really, really solid opponent. But I am glad you get the tune-up game against Portland State, essentially, to kind of work the kinks out, figure out the depth chart, get everything get your ducks in a row, so to speak. Great use of that metaphor by me right there. And then kind of get ready to go and play Texas Tech instead of going right into the fire against Georgia there. But now let's look, John, to the next cycle, because this 2023 class, look, Deuce Robinson is hanging out there. That's pretty much it from the high school ranks.
Yeah.
There's another portal window. I'm really curious to see what that looks like. It can't possibly be as busy as the one that we just saw, but you could still see some more action there. I would expect Oregon to lose more players than they add in the next portal cycle, because you'll have gone through spring football and understood the depth charts and everything.
Correct.
But question came in here that I thought you were the perfect person to answer, from someone named Sao Chow. All right, whatever floats your boat. With the 23 class almost wrapped up, what position or positions do you think Lanning will focus on for the next class? So looking at the 2024 cycle, I don't think quarterback is going to be low on the priority list. I think it could actually be pretty high, even with Novosad there. But the potential, you don't know what Ty Thompson's going to do. But even so, you don't want to go into a season with 2 scholarship quarterbacks. Maybe they'd hit the portal. I think quarterback could be there. I think tight end, linebacker, and maybe star safety. Those are kind of the ones that stood out to me. But isn't there also an element of this, John, that is kind of in a wait and see mode in terms of watch the 2023 season, understand where the team needs to improve in the long run, see who transfers out, and then kind of assess? That's kind of how I reacted to it. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think even with spring football, that's going to be kind of the galvanizing point. Get through the spring game in April, and then May 1st, sit down and say, hey, these guys are leaving. These guys are coming in. This is where we're at this point. It'll become really clear pretty quickly, I think, for the direction of the board. And that's just in the margins, right, Spence? Because look, every school has kind of their base plan. And for most, it's bringing in an entire offensive line, matching it with a defensive line, and a quarterback. That's like standard for every single class. That's basically 11 guys, half your class, done from a numbers perspective before you really go forward. And then, like you said, if quarterback is a big priority, do you consider one from high school, one from the portal, 2 from high school? Whatever that plan looks like, it will develop in relatively short order, again, because that's the time of year quarterback recruiting ramps up. Not coincidentally either. It's usually late spring, early summer when a lot of these quarterbacks start to come off the board and finalize their recruiting processes. And it's a lot of times that the schools are pushing most at that point as well. And then there'll be some obvious ones, right? Obviously, you're not going to just abandon the skill positions on offense. You always need secondary players and pass rushers. Those will always be a part of the class. But looking at last year, just one linebacker, one true off-ball linebacker brought in. I thought that would kind of be a natural area to add more. Look, from a volume perspective, linebacker is shrinking in importance, right? Because you've got so many DBs on the field, so many pass rushers on the field, but you still need them, particularly for early downs and when the weather turns. So I do think linebacker is going to be one of those priorities. I thought tight end like you did. They've already got one committed in 2024, so it's a good start in that regard for Oregon. So you see where they work going forward. But generally, you go heavy in the trenches, and you got to hit quarterback first, and then you build from there. And I think we'll have a much clearer picture here in a few months once spring ball comes to a close. Because like you said, you're going to get not only that evaluation of your own roster, but the portal ins and outs will be all but finalized by the end of that month. So you'll really know what you need to push for or not.
Right. And as you look ahead just to kind of the recruiting class as a whole, factoring in the portal and just assessing the total talent acquisition for 2024, right now, I'm with you that linebacker is there. There were more of those in the 2022 class that they seem to like because they've kept on the roster, Harrison Taggart, Devin Jackson among them. But yeah, they really only added Jerry Mixon as an actual linebacker in this 2023 cycle. I would expect that to be a position there. Defensive line was just a huge focus in this round of recruiting. I feel like that'll lessen a little bit. Not that it'll go away or they won't go after high level talent because you always want to, but I don't think you'll see. I mean, it's what, like eight to 10 total defensive linemen. Like it's
you can probably
some
cut
really
it in
high.
half.
Yeah. I think that will whittle down a little bit. Maybe they go a little more heavy on the offensive line, but I think tight end and linebacker, because as you look at tight end too, Terrence Ferguson after this year might go to the NFL. I think he is that sort of player. That's not a surefire thing. but you just kind of look at where the positions are stacking up. I think those are kind of the good places to evaluate there. John Garcia Jr., our recruiting insider here at the Locked On Network. Thanks as always, John. Good to talk to you.
Likewise, my friend. Enjoy Vegas.
Already underway. Appreciate everyone listening. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.